Hello, strange, dark, and mysterious people. Today we ascend to an altitude where the air is thin, the silence is absolute, and the secrets are frozen in time. We're talking about a group of seasoned mountaineers, a remote peak in the Canadian Rockies, and a discovery that defies all logic and sanity. This is the story of something found where nothing should ever be. This is the story of the trapdoor found 10,000 feet up a mountain. Our story begins with four experienced climbers, Liam, Ben, Chloe, and David. They were attempting a technical ascent of Mount Ymir, a massive, often overlooked peak known for its brutal, unpredictable weather and sheer isolation. The mountain was not technically the highest in the region, but it was certainly the most dangerous, attracting only the most serious and somewhat obsessive climber. The team was on their third day of the ascent. The weather had been surprisingly clear, giving them an unobstructed view of the vast wilderness below. They were navigating a particularly treacherous section of the mountain, a high ridge known as the Devil's Spine, which sat at an altitude of approximately 10,000 feet. This area was not rock, it was a desolate frozen plateau of packed ice and loose shale. Nothing grew here, nothing lived here, and absolutely nothing human should ever have been built here. It was Ben who saw it first. He stopped dead in his tracks, raising a gloved hand to signal the team to halt. He didn't point or shout, he simply stood there staring at the ground a few yards ahead of them. Liam, the team leader, slowly advanced and saw what had arrested Ben's attention. The plateau was a uniform gray and white of rock and ice. But embedded into this frozen expanse was a square, a perfect square of weathered dark iron. It lay absolutely flat against the shale and was only visible because the wind had scoured the snow away from its edges. It had a heavy iron ring handle resting flush against the surface. It was a trapdoor. A trapdoor 10,000 feet up a mountain, miles from the nearest trail, miles from the nearest cabin, miles from any recorded human activity. The initial reaction was confusion, followed quickly by a scientific curiosity. David, a geologist, immediately knelt down. He confirmed the surrounding rock was ancient granite and that the door was clearly an anomaly. It wasn't modern aluminum, it was heavy cast iron, showing signs of extreme cold and age. "It can't be a vent for a mine," David muttered, his voice barely carrying over the thin air. "There are no minerals up here worth mining, and it's too high for any kind of storage bunker." Chloe, the team historian, tried to rationalize it. Maybe an old weather station built during the Cold War? A bunker for equipment? But Liam shook his head. "Look at the rock work around it," he instructed. "It's not patched, it's built right into the stone. Someone carved out this mountain face just to set this door here." It took the four of them working together over half an hour to chip the ice and frozen debris away from the door's edges. Finally, they pulled the heavy iron ring, and with a tremendous groaning sound, the trap door lifted a foot into the air. A rush of air immediately escaped. It wasn't stale air or musty air. It was a blast of intensely cold but surprisingly fresh air, almost sterile. The team immediately recoiled as a fog of condensation billowed out. Below the trapdoor was a set of crude, uneven stairs carved directly into the bedrock, leading down into total absolute blackness. Liam held a flashlight down the opening. The beam of light disappeared almost instantly after about 20 feet. It was a deep descent, perhaps 30 to 40 feet. They couldn't hear the bottom. The silence that had defined the mountain now seemed to pour out of the hole, a silence far more profound and terrifying than any normal quiet. Liam, the leader, was cautious. "We are not going down there," he stated firmly. "This is too far off the grid. It could be unstable, it could be anything." But curiosity, that strange, dark human impulse, was stronger than their training. Ben argued. "Liam, we just found something that history says shouldn't exist. We have to look." We go down one by one, secured to the safety line. It was a catastrophic lapse in judgment. Liam reluctantly agreed. He was the first to descend. He secured himself to the main safety rope and slowly backed into the opening, flashlight in hand. He reported everything he saw as he went. Steps are uneven but solid. Walls are just raw rock. Feels man-made, not natural. Hold on. There's a landing at about 30 feet. Then Liam reached the bottom. His voice changed. It went from professional to profoundly disturbed. "It's a small chamber," he whispered. "Maybe 10 feet square. The air is freezing," and he trailed off. And what Liam Ben shouted down the hole, "What do you see?" There was a long, agonizing silence. Then Liam's voice returned a thin, strained sound. "It's a room, but the walls are covered in writing. Thousands of symbols. They don't look like any known language. They look like scratches. And there's a hole, a small hole in the back wall. It's about 5 feet high and 3 feet wide. It goes deeper." "Liam, come up," Chloe insisted, sensing the escalating terror. "We photograph it, then we get out." "No, wait." Liam's voice was barely a breath now. "The writing, it's all pointing to the hole. And there's a sound." "What sound?" David asked. "A hum," Liam said. "A very low hum. It's coming from the hole. It's getting louder." Suddenly, the safety rope went slack. Ben immediately shouted, "Liam!" Liam responded. "What happened?" Nothing. Total silence from below. A new sound then emerged from the opening, a high-pitched, squealing metallic screech, followed by a heavy impact sound, like the sound of a bowling ball hitting a wooden floor. Ben immediately clipped a small metal camera onto the rope and lowered it down the entire length. He pulled the camera back up, his hands shaking so badly he could barely detach it. They immediately crowded around the tiny screen. The footage was short. It showed Liam's initial view of the small carved chamber. The walls were indeed covered in strange, jagged symbols. The camera panned to the small hole in the back wall, and then the camera tilted down rapidly, showing what had caused the rope to go slack. Liam's backpack. It was lying crumpled on the floor. His headlamp still illuminated the small space, but Liam himself was gone. The footage ended abruptly, but not before showing the final terrifying detail. The entrance to the small hole in the back wall was now surrounded by a thick, viscous black residue like hardened tar. It wasn't there in Liam's initial report. It looked like something had rushed out of the hole and then immediately sealed itself back in. The remaining 3 climbers were frozen in place 10,000 feet up a mountain, facing a hole that had swallowed their leader whole. They knew they couldn't stay. They had to descend and call for help. But the descent was a nightmare. They were haunted by the heavy metallic groaning of the trapdoor in the wind, the absolute knowledge that their friend was gone, and the strange dark residue that now covered the rope where it disappeared into the earth. When they finally made it to the ranger station, 2 days later, exhausted and mentally broken, the authorities were skeptical. A trapdoor 10,000 feet up a desolate mountain, a hole that sucked a man into the bedrock. They launched an expensive and extensive recovery mission, but they never found the location. The storm that followed their descent completely buried the Devil's Spine in feet of new snow and ice, making it impossible to locate the exact spot. But the horror did not end there. Chloe was the one who suffered the worst. She couldn't sleep. She would wake up screaming, complaining of a constant high-pitched humming sound in her ears. She said the hum was a language, and she was afraid she was beginning to understand it. Her apartment eventually became littered with drawings. She would take a pen and scratch out the same jagged, nonsensical symbols she had seen on the walls of that small underground chamber. Her husband found her one morning, sitting in the kitchen, carving the symbols into the smooth wooden surface of their kitchen table using the sharp end of a fork. She was completely catatonic. The symbols they discovered were identical to the ones on the camera footage, a language of absolute fear. David, the geologist, tried to find a rational explanation. He theorized that the chamber was an ancient air pocket, perhaps filled with toxic gas that caused an extreme psychotic episode, and that Liam had simply wandered off a cliff edge and the rope snapped on a sharp rock. But that didn't explain the sealed hole or the black residue. And the fate of that final member, Ben, is perhaps the strangest detail of all. 1 year after the incident, Ben disappeared. He didn't wander off the grid or get lost in the mountains. He simply vanished from his own home. He was a meticulous man, a creature of habit. The police found his door locked, his keys and wallet on the kitchen counter, and his car parked neatly in the driveway. Everything was in order except for one terrifying detail. In the center of his living room floor, Ben had carefully arranged a small pile of mountain shale and loose rock. And on top of that small pile, he had placed a single heavy piece of dark weathered iron. It was a small replica of a trapdoor. He had built it himself, and he was gone. It seems that whatever entity or mechanism was sealed inside that cold, dark hole 10,000 feet up, Mount Ymir found a way to reach out and reclaim those who disturbed its ancient, terrible silence. It was a guest who waited in the cold dark, and when it was finally visited, it simply decided to extend the invitation permanently. The trapdoor was not a way to keep things out. It was a lock to keep things in, and once opened, it decided that the time for silence was over. So what do you think was sealed inside that mountain? An ancient secret society, a geological anomaly, or something far older and more alien than human history can account for? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and tell me where in the world are you watching this story from. Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.
Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, let's set the scene. The year is 2007. We're in a quiet, unassuming suburb of Portland, Oregon. The house in question, a two-story colonial with a detached garage, looked perfectly normal from the outside. It was the kind of house you wouldn't look at twice. And that's exactly what made what happened inside so terrifying. The couple who bought it were Mark and Julia Hayes. Mark was a history professor, a pragmatic man who believed in facts and documented evidence. Julia was an artist, creative and open to possibilities, but still grounded. They were in their late 40s and looking for a fresh start. They bought the house, located at 3734 Willow Creek Road, in a stack of rare Civil War-era letters worth close to $10,000, neatly piled on the left corner of his large oak desk. He left the study to grab coffee. When he returned only 5 minutes later, the letters were gone. He tore the room apart. Julia helped him. They searched for over 2 hours. Nothing. Mark, annoyed, blamed himself. He figured he must have moved them to a shelf while on the phone, forgetting the entire transaction. 3 days later, the letters reappeared. They weren't tucked away or hidden. They were back on the left corner of the desk, in the exact pile he had left them in originally. Mark was stunned. He hadn't touched the desk since the search. Julia hadn't been in the room. This wasn't just misplacement. This was a momentary, physical relocation of objects. The incidents escalated and began to involve their memory. Julia started forgetting conversations. Mark would mention something, say, a dinner reservation they had made for the following Saturday, and Julia would look at him blankly. Reservation for what, Mark? We agreed we were ordering pizza, she would insist. She would be so firm, so absolutely certain of her memory that Mark would start to doubt his own. Was he the one having the lapse? He was getting older, after all. The reverse also happened. Julia would bring up a detailed memory. Remember when we decided to paint the kitchen that pale blue? Mark would have no recollection whatsoever of the decision, the discussion, or the color choice. They would argue, becoming increasingly frustrated and scared by the gap between their realities. One evening, Mark was downstairs watching television. He paused the show and went upstairs to the master bedroom to retrieve his glasses. He walked into the room, grabbed his glasses from the nightstand, and walked back downstairs. He unpaused the television. He watched maybe 30 seconds of the show before he looked down. He wasn't wearing his glasses. He checked his pockets, knocked at her door, walked back upstairs to the studio, and sat down, completely forgetting why she had gone downstairs in the first place. She didn't realize she still needed the crimson paint until 20 minutes later. They started keeping logs. Not just a journal, but a detailed log of every object misplaced, every memory lapse, and every time they had to recheck a room because it felt wrong. They quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. The lapses in memory, the misplaced objects, they almost always occurred when they were moving between rooms, specifically when they were on the stairs or passing through the main hallway. The house itself seemed to be the trigger. The most terrifying moment happened in the month of October, 5 months after they moved in. Julia was in the living room. She glanced down the long main hallway toward the kitchen. She saw Mark standing at the kitchen counter reading a newspaper. She called out to him, "Mark, can you take the dog out in a minute?" Mark didn't move. He just kept reading the paper. Julia called again, louder this time, "Mark." Still no movement. She sighed and started walking down the hallway towards him. As she took maybe 3 steps, she realized something was deeply wrong with the scene. The Mark she was looking at was wearing a blue sweater. Mark had been wearing a gray one all day, and the newspaper he was holding looked like it was folded differently. She stopped moving. She stood motionless in the hallway. Suddenly, she felt a strong hand grab her shoulder. She screamed and spun around. It was Mark. He was standing right behind her, wearing the gray sweater. "What's wrong? Why are you screaming?" he asked, genuinely alarmed. Julia pointed frantically down the hallway. You were just standing there, in the kitchen, reading a paper." Mark walked to the end of the hall. The kitchen was empty. There was no newspaper. Julia was trembling. He was securing the bubble wrap with heavy packing tape when he paused. He looked at the reflection of the hallway in the wrapped mirror. Everything looked normal, but then he noticed something that was not normal. There was a section of the hallway wall near the coat closet that was painted a dark, unsettling shade of maroon. In real life, that section of wall was painted the same pale cream as the rest of the house. Mark immediately stopped packing and went to that spot on the wall. He touched it, smooth, painted cream. He backed up, looked at the mirror. The mirror still showed the maroon wall. He grabbed his flashlight and shone it at the spot. Nothing changed. The reality was cream. The reflection was maroon. Then he noticed a tiny, almost invisible seam in the wallpaper where the mirror showed the maroon section. He peeled back the cream wallpaper. Underneath, he found 2 layers of old paint. The bottom layer was a dark, dried blood maroon. He called Julia over. They spent the next hour pulling down all the wallpaper in that section. The maroon paint was there, sure, but what was behind the paint was the ultimate terror. Underneath the maroon paint, someone, the previous owner, perhaps had written thousands of tiny, repeating phrases. The phrases were written in a jagged, panicked hand, repeating the same lines over and over. Where is the key? It is not Tuesday. I didn't say that. I can't remember. It was a written chronicle of the same exact psychological chaos they had been experiencing. Someone else had lived in that house and been systematically stripped of their sanity and memory, just like Mark and Julia. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by a psychic residue of madness, the building itself feeding on the confusion of its residents. Mark and Julia left the house that day, leaving all their furniture behind. They sold it months later, disclosing everything they knew to the buyers, a large investment firm. They never got any confirmation, but they heard rumors that the house was immediately torn down and the lot paved over. To this day, they still occasionally catch themselves confusing a memory. Terrifying, systematic intrusion that made him question if his entire world was a carefully crafted stage set just for him. This is the story of he kept seeing the same woman in every crowd. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. Now, let's travel to Chicago, Illinois. The year is 2014. We meet a man named David Chen. David was 32 years old, working as a data analyst. He was organized, logical, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be quantified or proven with a spreadsheet. The incident that started everything was small, insignificant, and completely ignorable. David was scrolling through his phone, looking at photos from a major city marathon he had attended the previous Sunday. He wasn't running, he was just a spectator. He stopped on a wide-angle shot he had taken of the starting line, trying to capture the energy of the crowd. He zoomed in, just enjoying the chaos, when his eye caught a single face in the dense pack of runners, maybe a third of the way back from the front. It was a woman. She had distinct features, long, straight black hair, a narrow face, and a pair of large, square, red-framed glasses. It was a memorable face. David paused because the woman was wearing a highly distinctive bright yellow running shirt with a peculiar hand-drawn black symbol on the front, a jagged circle with a single line through it. David remembered seeing that symbol. He saved the photo and went on with his day. 2 days later, David was walking through the crowded downtown train station on his way to work. He was listening to music, lost in thought. As he passed a newsstand, he glanced at a large, brightly colored advertisement for a local theater production. It featured a dozen actors posing together, and there she was. Tucked into the background, fourth from the left, wearing a period costume but otherwise unmistakable. The woman with the uniform. He saw her face or a face identical to hers in a photograph in a college history textbook, identified as a suffragette from the 1890s. He found her in the background of a tourism brochure for a beach in Thailand. The woman was physically identical in every sighting, though her clothing and context changed wildly across time and geography. David wasn't seeing a look-alike. He was seeing the exact same woman consistently. He decided to document everything. Being a data analyst, he created a massive file he titled The Constant. He collected every image, noting the date, location, and context. He even found her in 3 different stock photos used by the company he worked for. He showed his findings to his friend, Michael. Michael, seeing the dozens of photos, laughed. "Dude, this is awesome," Michael said. "It's called pareidolia. Your brain has fixed on a particular facial template, and now you're seeing that template everywhere. It's just confirmation bias, mixed with an average-looking face." To prove his point, Michael printed out 5 random stock photos of crowds, instructing David to find the woman in them. David searched carefully and found nothing. "See?" Michael said. "Your brain just sometimes gets a little obsessive." David felt relieved. He knew Michael was right. It was a statistical anomaly created by his own mind. He decided to stop looking. He felt fine for maybe 2 weeks. He went back to his life, focusing on his work. Then came the elevator incident. David was alone, waiting for the elevator in his large, modern office building. The walls of the elevator banks were covered in shiny, polished stainless steel. He pressed the button and stood, staring blankly at his own distorted reflection in the steel panel while he waited for the chime. The elevator arrived. The doors slid open. David took a step forward, momentarily shown him the truth. The woman was always consistently behind him, just out of sight. David quit his job the next day. He liquidated his assets, sold his condo, and moved to a remote, tiny cabin in rural Montana, an area with a population of maybe 200 people. He cut off almost all contact with the outside world. He felt safe for a few months. He was completely isolated. He never went into town, ordering his supplies online to be dropped off at the end of his long dirt road. No crowds, no photos, no stainless steel. Then, one snowy afternoon, he decided to clean out the cabin's old basement, which hadn't been touched in decades. It was musty, filled with old mining equipment and boxes of junk. He moved an ancient, crumbling pile of newspapers. The top newspaper was from the year 1982, the local Montana paper, and the headline was about a major town council meeting. David used the paper to wipe the dust off his hands before tossing it. But just before he threw the paper into the trash barrel, he caught a glimpse of the photo accompanying the article, a wide-angle shot of the town hall, full of citizens attending the meeting. David dropped the paper. His heart seized up. Tucked away in the far corner of the photo, standing calmly by the exit door, was the woman. The black hair, the narrow face. But this time, she wasn't wearing an outfit from a different time or place. She was wearing a thick black down jacket, the exact same heavy coat that David himself had been wearing since he moved to the cabin. David stared at the photo, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a historical anomaly. This was now. The woman wasn't just appearing in random crowds, she was appearing in the crowds David currently frequented, or in the places he currently inhabited across time. He looked around the empty, cold basement. If she was in the 1982 photo wearing his jacket, then she was a constant observer, tracking him through time and space, mocking him by wearing his own clothes. He knew she wasn't an ordinary human being. She was or dead, but simply present, following you through time. It is a story that is truly strange, dark, and mysterious. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, to stay safe out there.
Hello, strange, dark, and mysterious people. Today, we're going deep into the woods of the Pacific Northwest for a story about an idyllic mountain retreat, a desperate family seeking peace, and a guest who arrived uninvited and simply refused to leave. This is the story of a man who was generous to a fault, a wife who felt a creeping dread she couldn't explain, and a property that was supposed to be a sanctuary but quickly became a terrifying confined prison. This is the story of the cabin guest who never left. Our story begins with a family. A husband named Andrew, his wife Sarah, and their daughter, who was only about 10 years old, named Liz, an idealist. He had always dreamed of escaping the rat race, finding a quiet corner of the world where he could focus on his writing, and where Lily could grow up breathing clean air. So, Andrew poured nearly everything he had into buying a remote property in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. It wasn't just a house. It was a rustic, two-story cabin set deep on several acres of private, untouched woodland, accessible only by a winding, unpaved service road. They moved in during the late summer, a time of long shadows and thick, comforting forest smells. For the first few months, life was exactly as Andrew had pictured it. Sarah, a gifted artist, set up a studio overlooking the pine trees. Lily explored the perimeter, learning to identify the local birds and the harmless small animals. It was bliss. They felt safe, isolated, and completely at peace. Andrew, however, had a personality trait that would ultimately prove to be disastrous. He was almost pathologically polite and accommodating. He absolutely hated confrontation and believed in the inherent goodness of people. The cabin was so remote that they went weeks without seeing another soul. So, when Andrew heard a knock on their heavy front door one Tuesday afternoon in the middle of a torrential downpour, he was completely taken by surprise. He opened the door, and there stood a man who looked like he had been dragged through the worst of the storm. He was tall, thin, and bundled up in thick, dark-colored outdoor gear that was now soaked in dripping water all over their porch. The man's face was obscured by the hood of his rain jacket, but his voice was surprisingly calm and deep. The man introduced himself simply as Mr. Finch. Mr. Finch explained that he was a backpacker, or perhaps a long-distance hiker. It wasn't entirely clear who had gotten hopelessly lost and injured his ankle on the slippery trail. He claimed he had been walking for nearly 2 days without food, looking for any sign of civilization, and was nearly hypothermic. Andrew, bless his naive heart, didn't hesitate for a moment. He was already pulling the man inside. Sarah, standing a short distance away, felt an immediate bone-chilling wrongness about Mr. Finch. It wasn't just his appearance, it was the way his eyes seemed to dart around their home, taking inventory of everything: the heavy, expensive furniture, the artwork, the layout. He didn't seem grateful or frantic, he seemed merely calculating. But Andrew was already bustling, handing Mr. Finch a warm blanket, a mug of hot tea, and telling him to dry off by the wood stove. Sarah, biting back her protests, went along with it. The agreement was supposed to be temporary, just one night until the rain stopped and Mr. Finch could hike back to his car, which he vaguely mentioned was down the road somewhere. The next morning, the rain had stopped, the sun was out, the air was crisp. Mr. Finch, however, was still there. He claimed his ankle was worse than he thought. He said he needed another full day of rest. Andrew nodded sympathetically. The day after that, Mr. Finch offered a new excuse. He said his backpack was ruined and needed to purchase new supplies. He suggested Andrew drive him to town, a 1-hour round trip. Andrew, ever the Good Samaritan, offered the drive, but Mr. Finch declined, saying, "Oh no, you see, I left my wallet in my real hiking pack, the one I had to ditch deep in the woods. I'll need a few more days to go back and retrieve it." This was the first time Andrew's easygoing nature started to crack, but he was trapped. How could he throw an injured, penniless man out into the cold? Sarah, meanwhile, felt her anxiety spiking. Mr. Finch quickly settled into a routine. He did not spend the day resting or even looking for his things. Instead, he would sit in the one armchair in the living room, facing the window and the dense forest, just watching. He barely spoke, and when he did, his words were vague and evasive. He didn't offer to help with chores. He didn't offer to pay for food. He simply existed in their space, taking up mental and physical room. He had established himself as a permanent fixture. Sarah started noticing small, subtle violations, things that individually were meaningless, but together formed a terrifying pattern. One afternoon, she came back into the kitchen to find Mr. Finch holding one of Lily's drawings, a brightly colored picture of a cat. He wasn't looking at it, he was smelling it deeply, like a predator scents its prey. When he saw Sarah, he simply smiled a chillingly blank smile and placed the drawing back on the counter. Another time, Andrew found the heavy iron skillet, the one they used for camping, removed from the kitchen, placed next to the living room chair where Mr. Finch Saturday. When Andrew asked about it, Mr. Finch just said, "Oh, I like to have it nearby, for protection." Protection from what? The only people for miles were the three of them. The terror truly set in for Sarah when she realized that Mr. Finch was leaving little trophies of their private life around his chair. A book Andrew was reading was dog-eared and placed on the floor near his feet. A single, small hair bow of Lily's was wrapped around the armrest. He wasn't stealing things, he was marking his territory. He was reminding them that he had access to their most personal spaces and items. The family stopped talking when he was in the room. Lily, previously so cheerful, became completely silent and clung to her mother. Andrew started spending most of his time in his study upstairs, nervously staring at his keyboard, unable to write a single word. They were now living their lives around the guest who wouldn't leave. One Saturday morning, Andrew decided he had had enough. He resolved to confront Mr. Finch, to politely but firmly tell him that he needed to leave. He just needed the perfect moment. While Andrew was outside chopping firewood, he decided to walk a short distance down the service road. It was here that he found a shocking sight. Hidden behind a thick rhododendron bush was a small, newly dug pit, and in that pit, covered carelessly with pine needles, was a backpack. Andrew immediately recognized it. It was a high-end waterproof hiking pack, the kind that cost hundreds of dollars, the kind that contained a wallet and presumably all the identification Mr. Finch claimed to have lost. He didn't touch it. He simply realized that everything Mr. Finch had told them was a lie. The ankle injury, the lost wallet, the hike, all of it was a carefully constructed fiction designed to get his foot in the door and keep it there. Andrew rushed back to the cabin, his heart pounding. He knew he had to get Sarah and Lily out now. He burst through the door and saw Sarah standing in the kitchen, pale as a ghost, holding a small sheet of paper. "Andrew," she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Look what I found." It fell out of his rain jacket pocket. The paper wasn't a map or a grocery list. It was a single, meticulously detailed drawing. It was an architectural sketch, drawn with professional precision, and it was a floor plan of their cabin. Every room was labeled, every window noted, and two particular spots, Andrew's study upstairs and the master bedroom, were circled in thick, dark ink. Mr. Finch wasn't a lost hiker. He was a meticulous planner. He hadn't gotten lost, he had found them. Andrew didn't waste a second. He grabbed Sarah and Lily, rushing them up the stairs to his study. They locked the heavy wooden door behind them. "We need to call the police," Andrew frantically whispered, reaching for his phone. He looked at the screen. No service. The cabin was designed to be remote, remember? They had a satellite landline for emergencies, but Andrew suddenly remembered that Mr. Finch had been sitting near the landline base for 2 days straight. Just then, they heard a slow, deliberate series of footsteps on the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Mr. Finch was coming. He stopped directly outside the study door. Andrew? Mr. Finch's voice was calm, conversational, and terrifyingly devoid of emotion. I heard a lot of noise. Are you all right? Andrew gripped the heavy fire poker he kept near the stove. He took a deep breath. Finch, you need to leave. We know you're not a hiker. You need to leave right now. There was a long silence from the hallway. A silence that was broken by a soft, chilling sound. It was the sound of a metal scraping on wood. Mr. Finch wasn't trying to open the door. He was simply and methodically scraping something against the door jamb. I don't think you do know, Andrew, Mr. Finch said softly. I know this cabin better than you do now. I've been planning this for years. He wasn't going to break the door down with force. He was simply going to wait them out. Andrew looked around the study. He saw the large, heavy desk, the massive window, and the bookshelves. He also saw the antique, heavy iron safe, a fixture of the previous owner bolted into the wall, a safe he had never bothered to open. Suddenly, Lily, who had been completely silent, pointed a small finger at the window. "Daddy," she whispered, "he's watching." Andrew looked out. Sure enough, Mr. Finch was no longer at the door. He was standing outside, near the trees, looking directly up at their window. He wasn't threatening them. He was simply waiting and watching. He was making sure they knew he was still there. They spent the next 4 hours in silent, agonizing terror. Every creak of the floorboards, every shifting shadow sent a jolt of panic through the room. Around sunset, Andrew had a desperate final idea. It was foolish, dangerous, but it was their only chance. He quietly moved the large, heavy desk directly in front of the door. Then he went to the window. The study was on the second floor, a drop of about 15 feet to the soft pine needles below. Too far to jump without injury, especially for Lily. But then, Andrew remembered something. The safe. He examined the safe, noticing the old heavy metal handle. He wasn't going to open it, he was going to use it. He took the thick, braided rope they used to tie down the canoe in the summer and quickly, quietly, tied a secure loop around the heavy iron handle of the safe. He checked the knot once, twice, a third time. He whispered his plan to Sarah. "We go out the window, I'll lower Lily first, then you. I'll tie the rope around myself and follow. The safe is the anchor." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide but determined. Andrew eased the heavy window open just enough to pass Lily through. He wrapped the free end of the rope securely around his waist, then gently lowered Lily down to the ground. She landed with a soft thud on the pine bed, silent and brave. Next was Sarah. She went over the sill, and Andrew slowly fed the rope out, letting her descend. He was the last. He tightened the rope around his waist, swung his legs over the sill, and began to slide down. As he was halfway down the side of the cabin, he looked up. He saw the study door slowly, silently begin to open. Mr. Finch, using his patience and perhaps a tool, had finally gotten past the desk. He stepped into the room. He didn't rush to the window. He simply walked to the safe, saw the rope tied around the handle, and slowly, deliberately began to untie the knot. Andrew didn't wait to see if the knot would hold. He let go of the rope and dropped the last 5 feet, landing hard but intact next to his wife and daughter. They didn't look back. They ran as fast as they could, tearing through the dense forest away from the cabin that was no longer their home. They ran until they hit the main forest road, where, by an absolute miracle, a kind, elderly gentleman driving a utility truck spotted them and took them to the nearest ranger station. The police arrived at the cabin before midnight. They found no one. Mr. Finch was gone, but he had left a message. In the middle of the living room floor, arranged neatly on the area rug, were 3 distinct items. 1, the backpack Andrew had found hidden in the woods, confirming Mr. Finch's entire story was a lie. 2, Lily's favorite stuffed animal, the one she took everywhere, placed precisely in the center. And 3, the heavy iron skillet, the one Mr. Finch liked to keep nearby, was now resting on top of the stuffed animal. The police searched the property for days. They found no trace of Mr. Finch, they checked local records, and found no one by that name. It was as if he had simply materialized from the forest and then just as easily melted back into it. Andrew and Sarah never went back to the cabin. They sold the property quickly, taking a massive loss, desperate to sever all ties with that terrifying place. The terrifying question for the family remains, why? Why spend months planning this? Why not steal the car and run? Why leave the ominous trophies? The only possible chilling answer is that Mr. Finch wasn't a robber or a vagrant. He was a collector of lies. He didn't want their possessions. He wanted control over their home, their routine, and their very existence. He wanted to feel the power of being the guest who completely and utterly took over. And the reason he finally left? He achieved what he set out to do. He terrorized them until they ran. He had successfully cleared the house, proving that it was his, and that he could make them leave whenever he wanted. And somewhere out there, deep in the strange, dark, and mysterious woods of the Pacific Northwest, Mr. Finch is undoubtedly looking for his next sanctuary. He's looking for his next host. He's looking for his next permanent home. So, what do you think? Was Mr. Finch a meticulous, dangerous serial squatter? Or was there something much more sinister, perhaps even supernatural, at play in those deep woods? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from? Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.
This story is about a phenomenon that defies the laws of probability and enters the realm of the truly impossible. It involves a woman who decided only to discover that someone, or something, had already found her. Imagine traveling thousands of miles, changing your plans at the last minute, and staying in places you never intended to visit, only to see the exact same face waiting for you at every single stop. This is not a story about a stalker in the traditional sense. It is a story about a glitch in reality that became a personalized nightmare. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It is always fascinating to see where these stories are heard. This is the story of the same stranger who appeared in every city I visited. Our main character is 28-year-old Sarah Jenkins. In the summer of 2022, Sarah was at a crossroads in her life. She had just finished a high-stress corporate job in Seattle and decided she needed a total reset. She bought a reliable used SUV, packed her life into a few suitcases, and planned a 3-month solo road trip across America with no fixed itinerary. Sarah was an experienced traveler, smart, and very careful about her security. Her journey began in June of 2022. Her first major stop was Portland, Oregon. She spent 3 days there, visiting coffee shops and hiking nearby trails. On her final afternoon, she was sitting in a crowded park called Washington Park, enjoying the rose gardens. She was sitting on a bench, reading a book, when she noticed a man sitting on another bench about 50 feet away. He was unremarkable, maybe in his late 50s, wearing a faded gray baseball cap and a plain navy blue windbreaker. What struck her was that he was staring directly at her, not looking away when she made eye contact. He didn't have a book, a phone, or a dog. He was just sitting perfectly still. She felt a small chill, but dismissed it as just another eccentric city local and headed back to her hotel. 2 days later, Sarah was in Boise, Idaho, over 400 miles away. She had decided to stop there on a whim because she saw a sign for a local street festival while driving. While walking through a crowded outdoor market, she stopped to look at some handmade jewelry. As she turned to leave, she saw him, the same man. The gray cap, the navy windbreaker. He was standing by a fountain, watching her. There was no way he could have followed her car for 400 miles without her noticing, especially since she had changed her route twice to look at scenery. Her heart began to race. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence, a common look for men of that age, but the way he looked through her was different. Sarah decided to push her luck and drove 10 hours straight to Salt Lake City, Utah. She arrived late at night, exhausted and paranoid. She checked into a small boutique hotel she found on an app just minutes before arriving. She didn't even use her real name for the booking, using a nickname instead. The next morning, she went to a quiet breakfast diner 3 blocks from her hotel, hidden in a side street. As she sat down with her coffee, she looked toward the window. The man was standing, starting to relax, laughing for the first time in days as Chloe told her stories about work. She felt the safety of the crowd. She glanced toward the elevator bank at the far end of the roof. The doors opened, and the man in the gray cap stepped out. He did not go to the bar. He did not look for a seat. He walked to the edge of the glass railing, turned his back to the city lights, and stared across the crowded deck until his eyes locked onto Sarah's. He raised one finger and pointed directly at her, his face devoid of any emotion. Sarah screamed, clutching Chloe's arm so hard she left bruises. Chloe looked in the direction of the elevator, but the man was gone. He had vanished into the crowd in a matter of seconds. Sarah told Chloe everything. They called the police, but there was nothing they could do. No crime had been committed, and Sarah had no photos of the man. The police told her to get some rest and stay in well-lit areas. The next morning, Sarah decided the trip was over. She was going to drive straight to her parents' house in a tiny town in Kansas, a place the man could not possibly know about. She drove for 8 hours, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror. She saw nothing but open highway and the shimmering heat of the road. She arrived at her parents' quiet suburban home at 10 o'clock at night. Her father, a retired police officer named Jim, met her at the door. She broke down in tears, explaining the stranger who was haunting her journey. Jim took it seriously. He locked every door, checked the perimeter with a high-powered flashlight, and sat in the living room with his service weapon nearby. Sarah finally felt she could sleep in her childhood bedroom, a place that felt truly disconnected from the outside world. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Sarah woke up to a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic thud against her window. Her room was on the second floor. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She slowly crept toward the window and pulled back the heavy curtain just an inch. The man was standing in the backyard, perfectly illuminated by the motion sensor floodlight Jim had installed. He was looking up at her window. He was no longer wearing the windbreaker. He was wearing the exact same outfit Sarah had been wearing the day she left Seattle 3 weeks ago, a bright yellow rain jacket and black leggings. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small printed photograph. He held it up against the light so Sarah could see it clearly. The photograph was of Sarah, taken from inside her SUV through the windshield while she was driving on the interstate between Idaho and Utah. In the photo, Sarah looked terrified, looking into her rearview mirror. But the most disturbing part was the reflection in the mirror in the photograph. It showed the man sitting in her back seat, inches away from her head while she was driving 70 miles per hour. He had been in the car with her. Sarah backed away from the window, screaming for her father. Jim ran into the room and then out into the backyard with his weapon drawn. But the yard was empty. There were no footprints in the soft garden soil under the window. There was no sign of anyone. The floodlight was still on, but the man had vanished. The next day, Jim took the car to a professional mechanic who specialized in security. They stripped the interior, checking under the seats, behind the door panels, and inside the trunk, looking for trackers or hidden cameras. They found nothing. But